The Sacred 28 didn't save the wizarding elite. They built their own funeral pyre. The idea of pure-blood supremacy wasn't a shield for these old dynasties. It was a self-destruct button that killed their influence, their sanity, and their future. From the genetic collapse of the Gaunts to the political suicide of the Blacks, you are looking at centuries of institutionalized self-destruction. Consider the House of Gaunt. They are the definitive blueprint for this collapse. By the time we encounter the final generation, they are a rotting, violent shell of their former selves. They were noted for a vein of instability that flourished through the generations, a direct consequence of their desperate, obsessive habit of marrying their own cousins to keep the bloodline untainted. This was a biological bottleneck. History records that as far back as the 1600s, figures like Gormlaith Gaunt were already using violence to enforce this isolation, famously killing her own sister Rhionach for the sin of supporting Muggle-friendly views. The Gaunts didn't protect their magic. They diluted it into poverty, madness, and total erasure. They traded their ancient wealth for a crumbling shack and a legacy of misery. Their madness was just the symptom of a closed system. When you cut off all outside genetic input, you don't get a pure human. You get a fragile one. The Gaunts show exactly what happens when magical entitlement meets biological decline. They prove that status gave them zero immunity to the damage of inbreeding.
Why did these families, who thought they owned the world, spend so much time engineering their own extinction?
The rot started with the math. In the 1930s, an anonymous directory, probably written by Cantankerous Knot, codified the Sacred 28. It was a social standard that demanded total blood purity, but it was built on a lie. The directory was a political weapon, not a science project. It was full of holes, including families like the Potters and Ollivanders, who clearly had Muggle roots that the author just ignored. The inclusion or exclusion of these families suggests that the list was never about objective truth. It was about political utility. If you were a useful ally to the cause of supremacy, your blood was pure enough to be listed. If you were a dissenter, you were cast out, regardless of your lineage. The directory was a social gatekeeping tool designed to centralize power among the elite, but it backfired by creating a false sense of security. It blinded these families to the changing reality of the wizarding world, convincing them that as long as they stayed within the 28, they were safe from the encroaching progress of history.
This obsession with purity was a wall that stopped them from surviving. To keep their status, these families practiced extreme, restrictive intermarriage. They turned inward, closing their circles until there was nobody left to marry but their own kin. The reality was brutal. The Gaunts proved that magical power, even the blood of Salazar Slytherin, could not stop the biological cost of their choices. They traded their future for a title, and in the end, that title was all they had. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was systemic. These dynasties spent centuries pruning their own branches. If an heir married a Muggle-born, or even a wizard of lower standing, they were cast out. This was just a slow-motion suicide. That motto, always pure, was the House of Black's death warrant. They disowned Sirius Black, Andromeda Tonks, and Cedrella Weasley. Every time they swung the scythe of disownment, they shrunk their own gene pool and severed their own support networks. They were obsessed with the idea that to be a Black was to be royalty, yet they were actively bleeding their own family dry. Sirius Black's own words capture the tragedy. They were convinced their status made them royal, but that arrogance left them isolated and vulnerable. By the time the First Wizarding War arrived, the House of Black had so few members left to carry the legacy that a single generation of conflict decimated their remaining influence. They were a house obsessed with its own reflection, unaware that the mirror was cracking. Now contrast this with the House of Crouch. They were the epitome of the proper pure-bloody dynasty, politically active, wealthy, and deeply embedded in the ministry. Yet, their adherence to the rigid, cold standards of the pureblood ideal led to the total moral and physical corruption of Barty Crouch Jr. The father's obsession with his own reputation and his rigid, uncompromising enforcement of the law blinded him to the rot within his own home. When the house fell, it didn't just lose its fortune or its status, it was erased from history in its entirety. The Crouch legacy is a reminder that when you prioritize the appearance of purity over the reality of human connection, you are left with nothing but an empty, echoing house. Then there is the House of Malfoy. They're the exception that proves the rule. They survived not by following the 28, but by being the most adaptable of the elite. They knew the pureblood ideology was volatile. They played both sides of the wars to ensure they stayed alive. But even they were tainted. By aligning with radical, violent movements, they made themselves perpetual targets. They traded stable influence for the short-term high of bigotry. It led them into the jaws of 2 wars, leaving them humiliated and stripped of their prestige. Look at the casualty list. By the end of the Second Wizarding War, the damage was absolute. The male line of the House of Black was gone. The House of Gaunt was dead. The House of Crouch was erased. We see the consequences in the empty halls of Grimmauld Place and the ruins of the Gaunt Shack. These weren't just houses. They were repositories of knowledge and influence, and they were thrown away for a fantasy. The history of the Sacred 28 isn't a story of preservation. It is a story of a slow, prideful suicide. They thought they were the pinnacle of wizarding society, but they were the architects of their own obsolescence. They believed that by closing their doors, they were protecting their legacy. Instead, they just ensured that when the world changed, there was nobody left to carry their name. They didn't fall because of their enemies. They fell because they couldn't stop pruning their own tree until only the roots remained. The blood purity ideology was an anchor that kept the wizarding world from moving into the modern age. It was a philosophy of static perfection in a universe that never stops changing. By refusing to grow, these families ensured they would be left behind. They were so terrified of the outsider that they forgot to care for their own. They treated their heritage like a trophy rather than a living history. Consider the political extremism required to maintain these beliefs. It wasn't enough to just believe in blood status. One had to actively enforce it. This led families to support volatile causes, aligning themselves with dark wizards who promised a return to glory. But this alignment was always a trap. It led to legal ruin, imprisonment in Azkaban, and death on the battlefield. The pureblood obsession was a catalyst for conflict, and those who championed it were almost always the first to be consumed by the fire they helped ignite. Their fanaticism ensured their downfall. As we look back at the ruins of these houses, we see that the most dangerous thing you can do for your legacy is to lock it in a cage. The Sacred 28 sought to defy the natural order, to freeze their status in time, and to keep the world at arm's length. They succeeded, but at the cost of their future. They proved that power, no matter how ancient or how pure, is ultimately a fragile thing.
When you build your identity on the exclusion of others, you eventually run out of people to exclude, and you are forced to turn that exclusion inward. The obsession with purity acted as a barrier to survival because it made these families incapable of empathy, incapable of alliance, and incapable of growth. They became islands in a sea that was rising, and they refused to build a boat. They were so busy counting the drops of magical blood in their veins that they failed to notice their veins were running dry. The pride that once defined them became the mechanism of their destruction. They were masters of a dying world, clutching at the remains of a glory that never really existed. In the silence left behind, you hear the truth. The only thing more dangerous than an enemy at the gate is the rot that takes hold when you lock the door from the inside. They were the architects of their own oblivion, leaving a warning for anyone who thinks purity means eternity. In the end, they weren't masters of history. They were its most tragic victims.